Hi and welcome to another very exciting quick tip tutorial. Today again we're going to deal with animations, and in previous tutorials we covered quite complicating animations already. And today we're going to see how easy it is to use simple UIView animations to create really cool effects. So let me just bring up the demo application called Animations here. And you'll notice that as soon as we start the application, we'll get some nice slide-in animations of those two buttons. And this was, if you hear a beep from time to time, please ignore that. That's just the office dishwasher that complains about being paused. So as I said, we have two buttons sliding in here. And once I click on one of those buttons, like animation 2 here, we get a nice animation actually for free, since we're using a navigation controller, and the show animation and the dismiss animation or back animation comes free if you're using segues. And then we have a cool bouncy button here, so when we click that we get this nice bounce effect, and we reduce the size back to its original state. And when we head back and click on the animation 1 button, we will see a really cool table view animation. So have a look at that. I think this looks pretty nice, and I hope that you will be able to use some of these techniques in your own applications. And for this project, I have created a starter project, which you can download below. There is a link in the video description for that. And let's just go ahead and start that right away. And let me give you a quick tour about what we have here. So we have a storyboard with 3 view controllers, and you'll notice that the initial view controller is embedded in a navigation controller. You can do that by clicking on editor and then simply embed in navigation controller. And we already have some constraints set for the buttons here. So they have a top constraint, their width and height is fixed. This is true for both of these buttons. And we're going to add a constraint that puts those 2 buttons in the center in a second. But here we have something pretty similar. We're simply fixing the width and height of that button, and also centering it in this view controller. This is a simple table view controller, and I've already created the classes for that and connected them. So we have a viewcontroller.swift file, a button viewcontroller.swift file, and a table view controller, which are all classes, and I've already connected them here in the identity inspector. You can see that I've entered the custom class for the table view controller and the table view controller, of course, and here in this button view controller, I have entered the button view controller class. So let's start though with the initial view controller here, which is just called view controller. And what we want to do is creating some constraints here to center them, to center those 2 buttons. And I'm pressing Control on my keyboard for that, and then I click and drag and pull a line up here to the bottom, and then I simply say center horizontally in container, and I do the same thing here for the lower button and center this horizontally in container. And these 2 constraints are quite important, since we're going to use them to animate our buttons. So what we need to do here is creating some outlets for them, and we can bring up the constraints here in our view controller scene, and these are the 2 constraints that we're going to use. So I'm bringing up the assistant editor, and what we want to do is create an outlet for both of them. So I'm control dragging to my view controller, calling the first one button 1 constraint, and let's do the same thing for the second one, button 2 constraint. And with that done, we can now configure those 2 constraints in our class in View.Load. And when we start our application, we want to make sure that both buttons are actually off screen. So we take the button 1 constraint and choose its constant, and then we simply subtract view.bounce.width, and then we can copy that and paste that and do the same thing for button 2. And then once we go ahead and create the view.appear function, we have to call super view.appear and pass along the animated argument. But now we can actually begin with animating all that stuff, and that's pretty cool. So I'm simply using UIView and then animate. And then, as you can see, we have a great bunch of animate with duration and so on functions. We have an animate with duration that simply lets us tell this animation how long it should be and what kind of animation it should perform. We have the same thing with a completion block, so we can, or a completion closure, which we can perform once the animation is done. We have an animation that can where options can be adjusted, and this is the one we're actually going to use. And there are keyframe animations, which we are not going to cover in this tutorial, but there are also there's also another great function that was introduced with iOS 7, which will bring us some of the bouncy animations that we're going to have a look at. So let's now choose this function that provides us with a duration, delay, options, animations, and a completion handler. And the first thing we need to specify is the duration. So let's say that we want to adjust it to 0.5 seconds. We don't need a delay here. We want to start right after the view did appear. And the options that we can specify are all of these. So we can curve ease in, we can curve ease in out, and you sometimes just have to try out some of those options you get. I go with curve ease out for now, and then we can state some animations that we want to perform. And actually all we want to do is bring our button back to the center. So what we need to do is say self button1 constraint, take its constant, and simply add again the self, view, bounds, and width. That's all there is to it. So this is what we can do. We can, for example, choose the constant of a constraint. We can use an alpha value. We can use the frame for animating. And this is very, very simple. But when you are dealing with constraints, what you always need to do is call layout if needed. So what we want to do is take our view and call layout if needed. And this lays out the subviews immediately again and is responsible for performing the animation when it comes to animating constraints. And then we can pass along nil as our completion handler since we don't want to do anything there. And then we can go ahead and copy that animation and simply choose button 2 instead of button 1. And with that done, we can simply try and run this in the simulator and see how our animation looks. So let's see what happens. There's the simulator, and we go ahead and we animate that in. And that already looks pretty cool, but if we gave our second button a little delay of, let's say, 0.3 seconds, then we can achieve even a greater look for our animation. So let's have a look at that again, and here we go, and that's pretty nice, isn't it? And what we have to take care what we need to think about is that we are putting this in view did appear. So if we move forward with our navigation controller and we segue to another view controller and we go back, then the same animation would be performed again. So let's create a little property here right above view did appear and call that animation performed once and set this boolean to false, and then we will check in view did appear if animation was not performed once, then we want to perform it. And so let's just cut all of that, paste it here, and then we can set animation performed once and set this to true. Of course, you should actually place a property like that in your property list at the top, but for you to keep it simple, let's keep it here so that you know what we're using that for. And with that done, we make sure that our animation is only performed once. So let's go ahead and have a look at those segues and the animations we get for free. So once we create segues between two view controllers, we use a navigation controller, we also get a back button. So let me press Control on the keyboard and let's use and just drag from the first button to our table view controller. And I simply choose the show segue here. And as you can see, we immediately get a navigation bar at the top. So let's do the same thing with the second animation and show that. And you can see again, we get this navigation controller. And once I run my application here, and we open up the simulator, we're really done with transitioning between those view controllers. As you can see, we go forward, we can go back, we go forward, we can go back, and this is completely free, no single line of code required. So let's go ahead and deal now with the bouncy button. So I'm selecting the button view controller now, and what we need to do here is simply create an action. So let's go back to the view controller, zoom in here a little bit, select the Be Bouncy button, and I'm bringing up the assistant editor now, and control click and drag to my code window here, and then I'm selecting an action as the connection, and let's just say we want our button to bounce. So let's perform this action here. So let's go back to the class, and first of all, we're going to need the bounce of our button. Since we did not create an outlet for our button, we have to use the sender here, that is an argument in our IB action. So let's create maybe the button as a constant, choose the sender, and convert it to a UI button. And we can be pretty sure that it's going to be a UI button. And then we create another constant here, which we are calling bounce, and we're taking the button's bounce so that we can animate it, and we can also animate it back. And then we use UIView Animate, and now we choose the function that includes the using string with damping. And this is really, really nice, and the effects you can create with that are endless, actually. So let's set the duration to 1 second maybe. We don't need a delay. We're using about 0.2 spring. We're using 0.2 damping, and let's say an initial velocity of 10. And we want this to curve ease in and out. And now let's start with the animations. And all we need to do is actually taking the button again and changing its bounce. So let's create some bounce here with the CG rect with X, Y, width, and height. And first of all, we should take the bounce, take its origin and its X position, and simply subtract 20. We don't want to animate the Y position, so we simply pass along the bounce, the origin, and the Y position. And for the width, let's also say that we want to add about 60 pixels. So let's take the bounce, the size, and the width, and add 60 here. And again, for the height, we do not want to change that. So bounce, size, height. And with that, we're done. And as I said, we want to animate our button back, since now it's a little bit expanded, and we can use the completion handler here. And once I press enter, I get the complete closure. And as you can see, we have one parameter here that we can use to check if our animation was successful. So we can check if success is equal to true, or just keep it simple like that. And then we use the button, choose its bounce, and reset it to the bounce constant that we created earlier. So let's simply run that in the simulator and see what happens. So let's go ahead, click on our animation 2 button and Be Bouncy, and this is pretty nice already. But as you can see, our return animation, or our shrinking animation, is not yet animating, which means that we can also encapsulate our, within the success handler, we can, or the completion handler, we can add another animation. So let's say UIView and animate, and this time we're simply using a pretty simple version of our function. Let's choose a duration of maybe 0.5 seconds and open up the animations block, and then we simply put this one line of code into here, run our application again, and then we have a nice shrinking animation as well. So let's see, we bounce and we shrink back. Pretty cool. So let's head back and let's have a look at the animation of our table view controller, which has about 50 elements in it. So as you can see right here, when we open up the table view controller, what I did here was giving the cell a reuse identifier in the attributes inspector, and that's all that I did here. And we can now go into the table view controller class, and as you can see here, I just removed some of the template code, I have added one section. I wanted 50 rows, and each row is configured, or each cell is configured to display cool effects and the current row that is displayed. And to create our effect, we're going to write a special function for that. So let's create a function. Let's make some space here. Right, and then let's call that Animate Table. And what we want to do here is, first of all, reload, take our table view, reload data, and then we create some cell. We want our all of the cells that we got from our, or that we can get from our table view controller that are currently visible, and therefore we're simply using table view and visible cells. And what we also need is the height of the table view, since we want to move all of the tables off screen and then move it in. So let's say height, or table view height, and we could simply use the table view here, the bounds, its size, and its height. And then we have to iterate through each cell and actually moving it down a little. So moving it down exactly the table view's height. And we can do that with a for in loop. So we take the cell in our cells array, and then we configure our cell using the transform property. And since we want to move it, we're using a translation here. So we use transform, and then we can specify a translation in X and Y direction, and we do not want to move it in X direction. We simply want to move it down the amount of the table view height. And we're going to need a second for in loop that performs the animation for each individual cell. So what we can do here is, first of all, create a for cell in cells for in loop. And then again, we're using UIView Animate. We're using Spring with damping and initial velocity, this version of our function. And let's say about a duration of 1.75 seconds. And now let's think about the delay, which is interesting because we want to move up each cell after the other. So we need to think about a delay counter. So let's create a variable here, which we're going to call delay counter. Set this to 0. And we then choose our delay counter, delay counter, and multiply it with about maybe 0.05. And let's also make sure that this is a double, since we need to provide the delay as a double. And with that done, we can move along, choose a damping of 0.8, and we don't need an initial spring velocity, and then we use the curve ease in out options. And then all we need to do in our animation block is one line of code, which is, again, choose the transform property and set it back to its identity, which is the original form of our cell, or also the initial position in that case. So let's set this to identity. We do not need a completion handler, and since we want to increment our delay counter by 1 for each cell that we iterated through, we use our delay counter and add 1 for that. And with that, we're actually completely done with this cool looking animation that you've seen in the intro of this tutorial. And what we need to do now is, calling implementing the view will appear function, call super view will appear, pass along the animated parameter that we got here, and then let's simply call animate table. And then let's run this. Let's see what happens. So back into simulator, and let's click on animation 1, and here we go. And if we press Command T on the keyboard or choose the debug options and choose slow animations, then we can see once we click on animation 1 that since we put our effect or our function in view will appear, our animation starts already when we begin sliding over to this view controller. So I hope you're going to have fun using those animations and building your own animations. As you've seen, dealing with UIView Animations is pretty simple, but it's a very, very great feature of the iOS SDK. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.